Well, in the search for ultimate answers, the philosophical search for ultimate answers, modernism's emphasis on reason ran into some major dead ends. And that's what we've been seeing in stage 5. So there's a sense in which stage 5 is the end of modernism. It's these dead ends that modernism ran into. But I put it in the postmodern era because this is really what postmodernism got birthed out of, was after modernism crashed and burned, hit these dead ends, then postmodernism was birthed out of that. So stage 5 is this conclusion that there is no ultimate answers, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, and it was a very depressing, crushing conclusion. And that's what caused people to start looking elsewhere. If there's no meaning that comes from up there in some transcendent realm, if there's no meaning out there, as modernism said, then the only other place to look would be in here for meaning. And this was the move inward. Sometimes it's called the subjective move. So people started to look for meaning and purpose inside of themselves now, ultimate truth. And this is the beginning of subjectivism on all sorts of levels. Subjective truth, subjective morality. So even last night at our Rosh Christi meeting, we had a debate between two atheists at the University of Nebraska and two theists, two Christians at the University of Nebraska, one of them being my son, Will. And even that debate, if you want to fit that debate into the history of philosophy that we're talking about, the atheists represented moral subjectivism. And they said pretty much last night, there's no meaning up there, there's no morality, moral truth out there anywhere, and really the only option they had left was to try to find moral truth inside of themselves. And so they were moral subjectivists. That's where they thought morality comes from inside themselves. So they rejected objective morality. There's no moral truth out there, but they had some form of moral subjectivism. That's what they described themselves as, moral subjectivist, where morality, this moral truth somehow comes from within them, their own desires. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing. All these philosophical thinkers are moving this direction to finding truth, whether it's moral truth or purpose and meaning for your life. They're finding it now inside of them. It's the birth of this subjectivism on all sorts of levels. So I've been calling this move faith by itself, because there's a sense in which faith, when it gets separated from reason, becomes this subjective thing. It becomes an emotion, a feeling. It's irrational. Reason isn't helpful here. It's just something that you believe internally. A leap of faith. We saw last week Kierkegaard, that phrase associated with him. So all of this is also a part of rejecting the emphasis on reason during the end of the modern era, particularly the Enlightenment. Their overemphasis on reason is being rejected now in favor of the desires and passions inside of us. Now, sometimes when people hear this, they're like, man, I never hear anybody talk against reason. I mean, who's anti-reason out there? Nobody's against science, right? That just seems such an odd thing to a lot of people at first. What's that even look like? Well, these folks aren't necessarily against science and reason, except when it comes to purpose and meaning, the ultimate answers. So they're very happy with science for technology, medicine, and they like science in that regard. What they're saying, though, is that science and reason, logic, these things aren't helpful when it comes to ultimate answers. Answers about morality, meaning, purpose. That's where science and reason aren't helpful. So the progression here of this thinking of Western culture is that science, supposedly, has showed us that there's no meaning out there. And that led to feelings of worthlessness, meaninglessness, and those aren't fun feelings. And so people were grasping, for any sort of meaning because they didn't want to accept that conclusion. It made them desperate for a solution, desperate for some sort of meaning, and their proposal then was to find meaning and truth inside of you. You can create your own meaning to life. There's not meaning out there or up there, but you can create your own meaning. And that was their desperate attempt to have some sort of meaning to life. Because a meaningless life is a very crushing, defeatist attitude, and it's hard to live in that mentality. So, as we saw with Kierkegaard last week, part of the mantra is to take a leap of faith. Don't worry about what science says. Science says love is just a chemical reaction. Forget about that. Just take a leap of faith and believe that love is real. Kind of like Anne Hathaway's character in that clip from Interstellar that we looked at. Just take a leap of faith and just believe in love because you feel it, you're passionate about love, there must be something there. Science says there is no such thing as love, but ignore that, ignore reason and evidence, and just take a leap of faith and just believe it because that's how you feel on the inside. And that becomes the strategy to believe anything, whether it's love or religious beliefs. This is the strategy used for any sort of meaning that you want to have in your life. It seems odd, it seems kind of silly, like almost wishful thinking, but remember, it's like they're a cornered animal. It's like they have nowhere else to go. They're desperate for meaning, and this was the only solution left, is to create their own meaning. So even though it seems silly, we might be empathetic if we understand their alternative. Because their alternative is just to say there's no meaning and purpose, and we might as well just all kill ourselves. So if you have that as your alternative, you can kind of see why they would go down this path, even though it does seem to us a bit silly. So Kierkegaard, just a little bit of review. Kierkegaard encouraged people to find something in their life that really they were passionate about. And that would be true for them. So find your truth. Find what you're passionate about and live in that. And that will give you meaning and purpose. Now for him, what gave him meaning, as we saw last week, was Christianity. But you can take his philosophy and put anything in that hole, right? And that's one of the reasons why I didn't tell you guys at first that he found meaning in Christianity, because I wanted you, especially Christians, to evaluate his philosophy without knowing that he found meaning in Christ. Because I wanted you to evaluate, I didn't want that to taint your evaluation of his philosophy. I'm glad that he found meaning in Christ. I don't know how real his faith was, if he actually believed it, or if it was just something that he pretended to believe because it helped him with life. So I don't know where he's at exactly spiritually. But regardless, people afterwards came and took his philosophy and didn't put Christ in the middle. They put all sorts of other things in the middle, but still took that Kierkegaardian leap of faith to believe it. So I evaluate his philosophy and criticize it for that reason, this subjective leap of faith. Well, we're going to move on to a new thinker tonight, and I want to start our discussion of him with a piece of music. So this is about a 2-minute long piece of music I want you to listen to, and that'll kind of kick off our discussion of this new thinker we're going to discuss tonight. So take a listen to this. It takes a little while to get going, so don't adjust your computer volume. It'll take a few seconds here to actually kick in. It starts kind of quiet. Now, I don't know how well that came through the video, but we'll put a link below the YouTube video that you can click on and listen to the music directly on your computer so you can hear it better. Like most people, I was introduced to that piece of music through the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's classic sci-fi movie from the 60s. I think that's what most people associate with it. And it's a beautiful piece of music. I love it. I think it's very moving. It's very powerful. I love the art of the music, so to speak. But it wasn't written for Kubrick's movie in the 60s. It was actually composed by Richard Strauss in 1896. So it's a very old piece of music, and he composed it to celebrate the ideas of the philosopher that we're looking at tonight. Well, how do we know this? Well, besides him saying so, he actually named that piece of music. He titled it, "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." And that just happens to be the most famous book written by this particular philosopher that we're looking at tonight. So we need to ask, who is this person, who is this philosopher that would lead a composer to celebrate his ideas with such powerful, wonderful music? And that philosopher is none other than Friedrich Nietzsche. So we're going to spend the whole night just looking at Nietzsche's philosophy and how it fits in to this whole movement, this whole postmodern movement, this turn inward, so to speak. Now, Nietzsche, as you see, lived towards the end of the 1800s, and he was very similar to Kierkegaard in many respects. Okay, I'm going to kind of list off some ways that he was similar to Kierkegaard. So, like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche rejected the Enlightenment's optimism about reason. Remember, in modernism and the Enlightenment, they thought reason was going to save the day, it was going to solve all of our problems, it was going to give us meaning and purpose. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche both completely reject that. Both of them said to look within for meaning and purpose. Not out there. Don't use reason. Look in here. Take a heroic leap towards your inner self. Also, like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche emphasized the inner passions and desires. That's where true meaning is found, in our passions and our desires. That's why he's known as another one of the fathers of existentialism. So existentialism technically didn't start until after World War II. It was a philosophical movement that we'll discuss in this class after World War II. But a lot of those existentialists, like Sartre, look back to these thinkers from the 1800s for a lot of their ideas. That's why both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are considered fathers of existentialism. So there's a lot of similarities between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Now, of course, they disagreed on what they found meaning and purpose in, but their philosophies were similar in that that's where meaning is found, internal to us, in our passions and desires. Now, Nietzsche, this is a difference between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Nietzsche had a much, how do you say it, maybe darker view of human desire, maybe a more pessimistic understanding of human desire. He didn't see it as pessimistic, but I think as we evaluate it, you'll see why some have described him as more pessimistic about our desires. According to Nietzsche, our greatest desires, or our greatest desire, is to exert our wills in the world. Okay? And so his philosophy is often associated with this phrase, a will to power. Will to power. And what he meant by that is we're all trying to fulfill our inner desires in the world. And the only way that we can do that is by exerting power, our strength, our force. So let me just give you a simple example so you understand what he's getting at. Let's say I desire ice cream. That's my passion. Okay, so I've got a desire for ice cream, and in order to fulfill that desire, I have to do it through power. So very simply, I need to, move my arms and scoop the ice cream and bring it to my mouth. So I'm exerting force, right? I'm using my muscles, I'm using power to make my desires come true, fulfill my desires through power. So I have a desire for ice cream, and to fulfill that desire, I use power to get the ice cream. Maybe I have to go and work to earn money, so I'm using power, force, strength in order to accomplish my desire for ice cream. Now that's just a simple example, but that's what he's getting at here when he talks about the will to power. That our lives are really all about exerting power or trying to exert our power and control over our surroundings in order to fulfill our inner desires. Now the reason why that gets a little dark is he recognizes that this becomes competitive then, because all the other beings, humans and animals, are doing the same thing. They're trying to fulfill their desires through force, through their strength, through their power. And if our desires conflict, or if we're competing, let's say for the same ice cream, or the same potential spouse, or to be the ruler in the country that you're in, if that's your desire, there's going to be competition. And so to fulfill our passions and desires, we have to defeat others. We have to win out. We have to exert our power, our control, our force in order to get our desires fulfilled. And that's what life is about. That's why life is so messy, because it's all this competition to try to fulfill our desires, the fight when we're trying to exert our power and control to fulfill our desires. And then, of course, the winner is the one who gets their desires fulfilled. That's the goal. And he said that's what life is all about. That's what life is like. That's what life is about in the animal kingdom, and we are just simply more evolved animals. That's what we're all doing, is we're just trying to fulfill our desires. So I thought about Nietzsche a lot, actually, last night when Will and Joel were having that debate with the subjectivists, because a lot of what the subjectivists were saying were very Nietzschean in essence. So by the will to power, Nietzsche is talking about exerting force and power to fulfill our desires in life and society. And there's nothing higher than this. This is all that life is about. There's no transcendent truth. This is all there is to life, is just trying to fulfill these inner desires. And it's only by doing this, only by trying to fulfill our inner desires, that we can overcome the emptiness of life. So in other words, this is the way that we can avoid the dead end of modernism, the dead end that life is meaningless. Well, we can find meaning, we can avoid the emptiness of life by chasing our desires. And really, that's all there is to do anyway. So let's pursue it as strongly as we can. It's very similar to Sigmund Freud. If you've studied much of Freud, talking about these inner desires. In fact, there's a famous phrase or a famous quote from Sigmund Freud, where Freud, who came after Nietzsche a little bit, Freud said he had to stop reading Nietzsche for fear that he wouldn't be able to come up with his own original ideas. He was just getting so much out of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was giving him so much ideas and information that he said he had to stop reading, or else he was afraid he wasn't going to be able to come up with any new ideas of his own. That's how much Freud relied on Nietzsche and his thinking. Now, I do want to say, if you listen to some lectures from other people about Nietzsche, sometimes people will try to put a positive spin on Nietzsche's will to power. So I heard a professor once give a lecture on Nietzsche, and where he tried to put a real positive spin on this. He tried to avoid the darker aspects of Nietzsche's will to power. And he said, really, all Nietzsche meant is that we should exert our power to, as artists. So exert power over things. Let's say that was a clay or a rock. And so we're exerting our power on it to create art, to create a sculpture. So really Nietzsche was just emphasizing creativity. That's what he meant by the will to power. And I would affirm, as I've read Nietzsche and studied Nietzsche, I would affirm that that's part of Nietzsche's philosophy, but I think it's very naive to say that's all that Nietzsche was talking about. Certainly he did talk about the power of creativity, and we exert our passions when it comes to art, and we use power to make our art, to express and fulfill our desires. That's all true. Nietzsche said all those things, but that's not all Nietzsche meant by the will to power. There was a lot more he said and meant by this idea of the will to power. That's just one aspect of it and doesn't capture all of Nietzsche's thought. So I don't think it's fair to just brush off these darker aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy. He was very clear about how this works out in practice. If we're all competing to try to fulfill our desires, and they conflict or compete with other beings, humans or animals, that are trying to fulfill their desires, well, what happens then if I hurt others in using my power to fulfill my own desires? And Nietzsche literally said that no act of torture, no act of rape or murder is intrinsically wrong. So here's how he defined what is good. Because I'm sure a lot of people you're probably thinking, well, what about morality then? What about right and wrong? What about good and bad? What did Nietzsche have to say about those things? Is it okay to fulfill my desires if my desire is to rape somebody or murder somebody? Well, here's how Nietzsche defined moral good. Nietzsche said, what is good? This is what's good. Everything that enhances the feeling of power, the will to power. And the power itself is in man, inside. What is bad? Well, everything that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? Happiness is the feeling that power is increasing, that resistance to your desires has been overcome. Not contentment, but more power. Not peace at any price, but war, if that's what fulfills your desires. Not virtue, but competence. So the first principle of our humanism, our philosophy, is that the weak and the failures should perish. And they ought even to be helped to perish. So clearly you can't say Nietzsche's philosophy is just about art and creativity. No, he's talking about serious life situations, and his advice as to what is morally good is to get your desires and passions satisfied at any cost. And that will be good for you. Might not be good for those that you have to exert power and control over, but it's good for you if you get your desires fulfilled. That's why a lot of people would say his philosophy is fairly dark, right? Pessimistic, if you will. But Nietzsche would just respond, hey, that's how nature works. That's just what life is. He used this example. He said, just walk through the forest, and what you're going to see is the will to power everywhere. You're going to see a fox kill a bunny because he's hungry and he wants to satisfy his passion for food, his desire to eat something, so he kills a bunny. You're going to see insects doing things to other insects that are hideous. but they're fulfilling their desires. They're using their power, their strengths, to overcome other beings to satisfy their own desires. And all we are just animals. That's all that exists, is just the physical universe. He was a naturalist. So that's just what nature is. We're just biological creatures fulfilling our desires. And it's good if we do so, no matter how it affects others. Nature is the only reality. There's no transcendent truth to somehow condemn us for these things. So you can see in his philosophy echoes of Darwinism. So obviously the theory of evolution in the middle 1800s, and so a lot of this social Darwinism thinking is reverberating through the culture, and you can definitely see that here in Nietzsche's thoughts and philosophy. Every organism is just seeking, and should seek, to maximize the expression of their will to power, their desires to get fulfilled, and this is just how it is. Actions, then, to judge whether an action is good or bad, you don't judge an action based on how it affects others. You judge an action on how it affects the person doing the action. If it accomplishes their desires, then it's good for them. If it doesn't accomplish their desires, then it's not good for them. That's how you calculate if something is good or bad, not on how it affects others, but how it affects the person doing the action. Now, I will say, pause for here for just a moment. If Christianity is false, if there is no God, and naturalism really is true, all that exists is the physical universe, if that's the case, I have a hard time seeing how Nietzsche is wrong. So in other words, Nietzsche can actually be a helpful ally sometimes in our conversations with atheists. So I interact with atheists in particular who believe in objective morality, but they don't believe in a transcendent realm. They don't believe God exists, but they believe that in some form of objective morality. And I actually bring Nietzsche over on my side when I'm interacting with them, because I say, actually, I think Nietzsche was right, that if there is no God, if all that exists is nature, the physical universe, material universe, then there is no objective morality. There can't be. And Nietzsche has a whole bunch of arguments, and a big part of his philosophy is arguing against people who are naturalists but still try to hold on to objective morality. So I would agree with Nietzsche in this counterfactual statement, that if there is no God, there can't be any objective morality. So Nietzsche argued for that counterfactual, and I do as well. The only real way to have objective morality is if there is a transcendent realm. Okay, well, let's shift gears for a little bit. One of the best ways to understand Nietzsche's philosophy is to see how he interpreted Western history. Okay, there's a sense in which in this class I'm giving you my interpretation of Western history, and I want you to study Western history and just don't take my word for it, all these things, but I'm doing my best to try to faithfully explain what happened in Western history, but I could get things wrong, so study it yourself, right? Don't ever just take my word for it. Nietzsche had an alternative position when he came to interpreting Western history. And I want to walk through how he saw the history of Western civilization. And when you do that, when you understand his position on the history of Western philosophy, Western history, Western civilization, then I think you can understand his philosophy better. So first of all, the first thing that Nietzsche said is that Western civilization was in the midst of a crisis. This was the late 1800s. He wasn't the only one saying this. It was a very pessimistic time in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The era of the era of optimism was over with. Okay, the idea that technology and science and reason was going to do all these great things for us and fix all of our problems, that was gone. And people were now seeing that no, and there's a sense in which it was actually making life worse. And so Nietzsche and others were saying we're in a crisis. Western civilization is in a crisis here. So Nietzsche was trying to diagnose what was wrong. What made civilization so sick? Why are we in this problem right now? Well, Nietzsche said the problem stemmed from the fact that our Western culture had adopted a herd mentality. A herd mentality. A mentality that was more concerned about trying to keep old traditions, social conformity. This would be the era of a Victorian culture that is just trying to hold on to the past, social conformity. Whereas he said what people should be doing is not just holding on to these past traditions, but chasing after their passions and desires. So he set out to say, okay, where did we go wrong? Looking back at our Western history, where did we take a wrong turn to get where we're at now? So his high water mark, when he looked back through Western history, what he said was the greatest time was in ancient Greek. So in the ancient Greek world, the Greeks honored these strong heroes. Okay, and this was the right path. This is what was, Western civilization was on a good path at this time in history. The ancient Greeks. So they were honoring strong heroes who followed their passionate instincts for greatness and power. So that was kind of his high water mark for Western history. But then he said, some people, 3 guys in particular, came along and messed everything up. Anybody want to take a guess on who those 3 guys were? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. He said these 3 guys got us off the right track. We were on the right track. We had these ancient Greek heroes, and they were, think of like Alexander the Great, maybe. I'm just using him as a type. But those sort of strong, passionate heroes who were going to excel and try to fulfill their desires, conquest, conquer others, chase after greatness. That was the best. But then these 3 guys come along and they messed it all up. They got us off track by emphasizing reason too much. They actually said, this is how messed up they were, according to Nietzsche, that our rationality should rule our passions. That our reason and our rationality should override our passions and desires. That we should keep our passions and desires in check. They should be restrained by our rationality. And so they emphasized reason too much and messed up the whole Western path that we were on, Western society was on. They called for moderation. They called for moderating your passions and desires. Don't let them get out of control. Push them down with your reason and rationality. And that messed everything up. And with them began, 2,500 years of Western civilization wasting their time on logic and reason and abstract metaphysics, sitting around speculating about things with their reason and logic, just wasting time when they should have been pursuing their passions and desires. And so when he looked at the Enlightenment, when he looked at modernism in the 1600s, 1700s, he said that is really, in a sense, just a culmination of the bad path these guys put us on. This overemphasis on reason and logic. And so it's foolish, according to Nietzsche, it's foolish to think that reason and science could give us meaning to life. That's why modernism hit a dead end, according to Nietzsche, because they were looking for meaning and purpose with reason and rationality. And that's not what life is about. Life is about pursuing our will to power, fulfilling our desires and passions. And so these guys distracted us from our true meaning, our true purpose, and got us off the right path through their emphasis on reason and rationality. So before we move on in Nietzsche's interpretation of the history of Western philosophy, I want to show you another one of those videos. These are the guys that use 8-bit video game graphics to communicate different philosophers or philosophies. So this is a short one they put together on Nietzsche's view of science and reason. And I think it'll summarize well in a humorous way what I've been trying to say the last half an hour. So take a look at this, and we'll put the link to this video below on YouTube so you can click on it and watch it directly if this doesn't come through very well. Whoops.
Does it lead us to truth? German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was an avid science enthusiast, but he also recognized that even science has its limitations. See, science touts the ability to explain the world when, according to Nietzsche, it can only describe it. For example, science might attempt to explain why fire burns by saying it's an exothermic combination of a combustible material with oxygen. That certainly describes how fire burns, but it doesn't quite address why. As in, why does fire exist the way that it does? Although science has allowed us to describe the world in greater detail, we're still completely clueless as to the meaning behind it all. As the philosopher who famously said, God is dead, it's obvious that he isn't criticizing science in favor of religion. But he recognizes this dilemma. Religion attempts to answer the question of meaning, but the achievements of science have cast doubt on such beliefs. Science may try to fill this void of meaning, but it can't. Because as Nietzsche said, science has no consideration for ultimate purposes. Problem for Nietzsche is most people don't recognize this limitation and instead worship science as a kind of new religion, an objective value for a godless age. Just turn on the telly and you'll see how even science can become evangelized.
And that is a scientific fact.
Because the Bible says so.
Proven by real science.
It is God's will. Nietzsche dares us to take a step further, to not only think critically of religion, but to think critically of knowledge itself. For worshipping knowledge for knowledge's sake can lead to dire consequences. As he said, man shouldn't be the servant of knowledge. Knowledge should be the servant of man.
So you can see, just in that quick little summary of part of Nietzsche's philosophy, what I've been trying to say is that, the pre-modern era, we saw truth and meaning coming from God, from a transcendent realm. Modernism came along and killed that way of thinking, so to speak. And then modernism tried to erect a new meaning and purpose through science and reason. And then that failed. And Nietzsche points that out. And then Nietzsche said, we can't go back to the pre-modern era because science has shown that God doesn't exist, there's no transcendent realm, and modernism failed to provide meaning and purpose. So now we're going to do this new thing and create our own meaning and purpose. So you can see that Nietzsche is laying, in that sense, Nietzsche and I have a similar understanding, and I think both of us were correct in seeing how this is what Western philosophy, these are the stages that Western philosophy moved to. He just thinks that that's a good thing, and I would say that that's what happened, but I think it was a mistake that they went down both these paths, modernism and then now postmodernism. And so I advocate for actually going back to that pre-modern way of thinking, that there is a transcendent realm. So Nietzsche, though he liked science, he rejected and hated the Enlightenment approach to try to find meaning and purpose through reason. But there was one movement that he hated even more than the Enlightenment movement, and that was, of course, Christianity. So Nietzsche despised Christianity with a passion. He said that Christianity has made our civilization, our Western society, sick. So this is a quote from one of his books, The Antichrist. Nietzsche said that Christianity is a revolt of everything that crawls along the ground, directed against that which is elevated. So Christians are like the maggots that have destroyed the greatness in our society, the eagles, the potential Greek heroes that we could have had. Christianity has destroyed all of them, and by doing that has made our society sick. Now, to understand his hatred for Christianity, you have to understand his view of morality. So Nietzsche was a relativist. He said that a person's moral view was relative to how much power he had, going again back to his will to power. So a person's view of morality is going to be dependent on how much power that person has. In other words, people who are in power, who have strength, who are getting their passions and desires fulfilled, they're going to have a certain moral perspective. And then those who are weak, those who don't have power in society, the slaves, if you will, the weak ones, they're going to have a different understanding of morality. So your view of morality is going to be dependent on how much power you have, how powerful a position you hold in society. So think about those in power for a second. Those who are in power, what do they see as good? Well, to them, those in power, what's good is nobility, strength, pride, honor, power, of course. All of those things are good if you're in power, because those are the things that you use to fulfill your desires. This is what the early Greeks valued. That's why he liked the early Greeks so much, because they understood good to be those things: pride, honor, strength, nobility, power. What about if you're not in power then? Those that aren't in power, the weak ones, the slaves, if you will, they're going to view nobility, strength, pride, honor as evil, because that is what they associate with their oppressors. They hate those in power. They're jealous of those in power. They're being oppressed by those in power. And so they see all of those things as being evil, because that's their enemy, those in power who are prizing those things. And he said the greatest slave morality in history, the greatest, not great as in good, but the most influential type of slave morality was the slave morality, the slavish way of thinking about morality that developed among the Jews. So he was very anti-Semitic, he hated the Jews, and he said when the Jews were slaves in Egypt, they developed this sort of slave morality. And they were forced, because of their position in society as slaves, the weak ones, they had to value weakness. They really had no choice. I mean, they wanted to be in power, they wanted to fulfill their passions and desires, but they couldn't because they were weak. And so to make themselves feel better or justify their position, they started attributing things that the powerful had as evil. So pride was evil, power, of course, was evil. Anything associated with those in power was evil. Honor, strength, nobility. And what they said instead is, we are actually the good ones. They tried to justify their own weakness by inventing this slave morality. So they said, humility is what's good. You know, we don't want to take power over others. They really did, but they couldn't, and so they justified their weakness and duped themselves into thinking that being humble and turning the other cheek was actually a good thing. So kindness, looking out for others, putting others first, this is a slave type of view of morality. And they really had no choice. But to justify themselves or to make them feel better about their position, they invented this way of thinking of morality. So it's crazy, according to Nietzsche, this is crazy what happened, in that they turned weakness into a virtue. And their way of thinking became so twisted that they turned weakness into a good thing. Then they created, according to Nietzsche, they created this idea of God who was going to rescue them from those in power and reward them for their weakness, reward them for their humility, for putting others first, not fulfilling their desires. That became morally good for the slave morality view. So they invented this idea of God to rescue them, reward them for being weak, reward them for being humble. And that's where the idea of God came from, according to Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche said, look, this slave morality was developed, and there's a sense in which, I understand that those people really had no choice. They had to do something to make themselves feel better. And so the weak, not only the Jews, but other slaves and weak people all the time do this. But what infuriated Nietzsche is that somehow the slave morality of the Jews didn't just stick with the Jews. It would have been one thing if their invented slave morality would have just stayed with them. I mean, Jews relatively are a small slice of the human population or the Western population. But what infuriated Nietzsche is that the slave morality was repackaged into Christianity and then spread all around the world. And this infuriated Nietzsche because the way he saw it was that this slave morality that the Jews invented, somehow they convinced everybody in the Western world to adopt this slave view of morality. And that's what's been making our civilization sick for thousands of years, that we've adopted, everybody, Christian, the Western Christian world, has adopted this slave morality. And it causes people to think that their passions and desires are somehow evil, and exerting power, trying to accomplish things and be prideful about what you can do is somehow evil. And it's totally messed up our society. He said that Christianity dehumanizes people. It weakens them because it tells them that they should suppress their healthy desires. It tells them they should suppress their will to power. It says that our human desires are bad. Christianity is not a good way of thinking because it devalues the world. It devalues the body. It just causes people to dream of escaping this world, escaping their bodies, escaping their desires, which they should be trying to fulfill. So he saw Christianity as something that devalues human beings, that denies everything that makes humanity great. He said that Christianity just made people ashamed of their passions and desires and caused people to think of themselves as weak puppies, incapable of greatness, and just instead projected greatness on this made-up God. So instead of projecting greatness on some pretend being God out there, you should strive to be great yourself. Don't put yourself down and elevate this hypothetical God. Put yourself up. Make yourself great. And he was so frustrated that this slave morality had spread around the world and had become the dominant view of morality. The slaves had won. The weak ones have won. They've overcome somehow through this twisted morality. They've defeated those who should be in power, the strong, those who are chasing their passions and desires. And this needs to be fixed. This needs to be reversed. Now, he also wasn't a fan of Enlightenment political ideas. He saw, and rightfully so, that a lot of the political ideas, democracy, individual rights, so on and so forth, was just a secularized form of Christianity. So he saw a lot of this, the political ideas coming out of the Enlightenment, as just Christian ideas without all the metaphysical baggage. And I think he's right in that. I think a lot of our political ideas in the 1700s were an outworking of Christian beliefs. And so in that sense, I think it's a wonderful thing. But he saw that, and that's one of the reasons why he rejected a lot of the politics, the political theory that came out of the Enlightenment. He hated democracy. He said that democracy represents the disbelief in all great men and in all elite societies. Democracy makes everybody equal. And he said, how stupid is that? We're not equal. Some of us are better than others, and we should celebrate that. We should let the better ones dominate the weaker ones. So he hated democracy and this idea that we're all equal. He said there's just a secularized version of the slave morality all over again. It was a mistake to celebrate or promote the common person. It was a mistake to celebrate mediocrity. Why are we celebrating the average person? We should celebrate the great ones. They should be the ones who take control. We shouldn't let just the average person, who's, most people are weak, and they shouldn't be promoted. It was part of that herd mentality that he was arguing against. He just saw mass culture as a bunch of followers, a bunch of weak, pathetic sheep. And democracy celebrated that and gave the sheep power. He said, no, we need strong leaders, not making everybody at the same level. So I want to share with you another video, and this is another 8-bit video game philosophy video. And in this one, they are describing his view of Christianity. So it's just kind of summing up what I've gone over the last 20, 30 minutes.
Imagine, dear viewer, that a basketball team crushes its opponent by over 100 points. In the world we live in, the winning coach may get fired for such a display. Certain children's leagues refuse to even keep score, and participation trophies abound. Mediocrity is celebrated, applauded, and encouraged, while the celebration of excellence is frowned upon. But where does this desire for mediocrity come from? For Friedrich Nietzsche, the answer is simple. Christian morality. The Christian ethos and its call for piety, obedience, reciprocity, compassion, moderation, and equality, the Christian metaphor of a shepherd and his flock, all are symptoms of a weak form of morality. These beliefs stem from an inability to deal with the strengths of other people, of a need to be led. Strength, cunning, brilliance, exuberance, and wealth, these are the things society ought to value, yet they are devalued. In his book, On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche uses the example of lambs and birds of prey. Large birds carry lambs away to their death on a pretty regular basis. It would be understandable for the lambs to call birds evil, but to Nietzsche the terms good and evil don't make sense because the will to power complicates these concepts. The will to power is the drive to maintain control, power, and success in life. Nietzsche famously asserted that this world is the will to power and nothing besides, and you yourselves are also this will to power and nothing besides. The world that we live in is one in which people, all life, compete to strive and even flourish. Each species has different instincts and strengths. Neptunes use hard hats for protection. Tiger and lion bots eat tourists, and Iceman uses his cold, steely eyes to freeze his prey. The will to power isn't just biological. Every choice we make, all of the techniques that we use to live a happy and content life are all part of our will to power, of our desire to thrive in the world. If a tiger eats a tourist, that's good for the tiger, not the vacationer. For Nietzsche, the will to power is that part of us that annihilates moral considerations. From the beginning of time, the lions of the world have eaten the lambs. Though one may argue that's not how the world ought to be, that's just the way it is. Through the valorization of a single code, a universal morality that dictates what is good and evil, Christian morality keeps people in line. It renders people an undifferentiated mass that smothers the individual's will to power. It gives people a convenient excuse to be ordinary. Most of the time, people resist the urge to stand apart. They're afraid to be different, to be alone, and are more likely to assimilate. But Nietzsche thinks people should aspire to be exceptional. People may feel smug when a coach gets fired for running up the score. Perhaps it feels good to blame a loss on deflated footballs, to vilify others for success. Lambs may feel justified hating birds of prey. The large birds of prey value their strength, while lambs of the world value their unimportance, weakness, and passive nature. Plainly speaking, the lamb hates the bird because the bird is better than it. So, dear viewer, how many participation trophies do you own? Hello, dear viewer. If you like the show, some other ways you can show your support.
All right, so we've looked at his diagnosis of the problem. We've seen Nietzsche's, what he thinks has made Western society sick. It's both Greek philosophy, the Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, emphasis on reason, and the slave morality. These two things combined have ruined Western society, according to Nietzsche. So what's his solution? How do we overcome this? How do we make society great again? Western society great again, so to speak. What was his solution? Well, he did like the scientific revolution of the Enlightenment. He did like science in the sense that science destroyed the idea of God. So Nietzsche famously said God is dead and we have killed him. He was an atheist. He never believed that God ever existed. What he meant by this is that the idea of God has died out. And he thought that was a good thing. That was the one good thing that came from the Enlightenment, is that we finally killed off this idea of God. So now we can move on. We killed God by not believing in him anymore. Science showed that there is no God, according to Nietzsche. There's no transcendent realm of objective morality. There's no meaning up there. Now, what he said science made the mistake of, the Enlightenment made the mistake of, is thinking that they could find meaning and purpose, morality out there somewhere. He said that was a mistake too. So now what he's saying, his solution is to get back on the right track, to make our society healthy again. We've got to, what his hope was, is that some new leaders would arise, some new heroes, like from ancient Greek, would rise up. He was very frustrated that people were still holding on to this slave morality, that Christians and Western society were still holding on to this slave morality, Christian morality, even though God was dead. And so a lot of his work, a lot of his philosophy is to show, now that God is dead, there's no foundation for objective morality. And this is in fact what is causing Europe, this crisis in Europe, is because we're trying to live this lie. We're trying to still hold on to objective morality when we've cut out the foundation of it. We've cut out God, but we're still trying to hold on to objective morality and not realizing that we've cut the foundation out from underneath us. So we're living a lie. We need to be brave enough, and that's what he was looking for, is some brave new leaders to help us break away from this slave morality. So to break away from objective morality, to break away from objective truth even. He said that the idea of objective truth was a Christian idea as well, that we need to break away from. So how can we have meaning then? If the world is meaningless, if that's the conclusion of modernism, then how can we have meaning in a meaningless world? Well, his plan, his suggestion, was to admit that there's no meaning out there. Science has shown us that. There's no meaning up there. And to move beyond this slave morality, these categories of good and evil. What we need now are some brave new heroes who will create their own meaning, create their own values. Not discover them, but create them. Define their own truth, not through rationality or universal absolute truths, but from their instinctual passions, their will to power. And he said these few brave ones, these new heroes, are going to be the overmen, or sometimes it's translated the Supermen. In German, it was I think it's pronounced Übermensch. So the Supermen, these are the new heroes that are going to rise up. And he described them as thinking with a hammer, because their thinking is going to destroy this slave morality that has infected our Western culture. These few new supermen are going to break out of the herd mentality and create their own truth. They're going to be our new elite leaders, which of course he saw himself as being one of these Übermensch, that they were going to be able to create their own truth, create their own morality as they chased after their passion and desires. So he said we create our own truth, we create our own morality. We do that through our language and our culture. And so then what is good, what is morally good, or what is morally true is what's based on what's best for the person doing the actions. And these overmen, these supermen, will be strong enough to make their own truth, their own morality. They'll be able to impose their will on others through their greatness. And so he would write things like this. I'm teaching you beyond man. I'm teaching you Superman. Man, as it exists now, is going to be surpassed. What are you doing to surpass? What are you doing to become one of these supermen? Now you might be thinking, now that we have the hindsight of living through the 20th century, remember he was writing at the end of the 1800s. And you might be thinking over this last hour that some of his thinking, some of his ideas sound scarily familiar. And you'd be right in thinking that. Because there's a sense in which the fascist leaders like Hitler and Mussolini saw themselves as these supermen. They were both fans of Nietzsche. In fact, I've heard that the German soldiers, when they were sent out to fight in World War I, they were given Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, as reading material out in the field of battle. So it seems as though Nietzsche's ideas, at a minimum at least, fueled the thinking of people like Hitler and Mussolini, and that they saw themselves as implementing Nietzsche's philosophy. There's a movie that I might recommend. It has been out for quite a while, but it's a movie that kind of explores some of Nietzsche's philosophy. Sandra Bullock is in it. Ryan Gosling is in it. It's a movie called Murder by Numbers. So if you're looking for a movie to watch this weekend and you want to learn more about Nietzsche, you might want to take a look at Murder by Numbers with Ryan Gosling and Sandra Bullock. It's actually based on a true story, so it's interesting historically from that sense. Now, the last thing I want to say, will be done here in just a few minutes. The last thing I want to say about Nietzsche is not only was he influential in thinkers like Hitler and Mussolini, who saw themselves as Nietzsche's supermen, but a lot of Nietzsche's thinking a lot of his philosophy becomes key parts of the postmodern movement. The way that I've been using the term postmodernism is to talk about, the 200 years, the 1800s and the 1900s of this move inward. And it's like a snowball barreling down a hill where it just picks up more and more ideas. And this postmodern thinking, as it's barreling down the hill, picking up ideas, it picks up a lot of ideas from Nietzsche. So you might have heard echoes of Nietzsche, for example, in critical theory. And you'd be exactly right. There's a lot of ideas from Nietzsche that get picked up in different movements. Existentialism, as we'll see, critical theory, the postmodern philosophers in the 1970s and 80s, admittedly pull things from Nietzsche, pull Nietzsche's ideas. So let me just say a couple ideas that come from Nietzsche that got picked up in this postmodernism. So one of Nietzsche's ideas that became a huge part of postmodernism is that language isn't really about communicating truth. That's not the purpose of language. That's not what we use language for. A lot of people think that's what they're doing with language, but language ultimately isn't about communicating truth. Language is just a tool that we use to exert our power over others. Language is just our way of exerting power over others. Language is a way that we can do that. So we claim to be communicating truth, but what we're really doing is exerting power and control over others with language. And this is what a lot of people, for example, criticize Donald Trump. And they're attributing to him, Nietzschean ideas. That Trump, for example, critics of Trump would say he's not communicating truth, he's just using language to exert his control, his power over others. So what he's saying isn't true, he's just using his language, his rhetoric, to exert power and control over others. And that's how language is always used. That becomes a very common, a very big part of the postmodern way of thinking, that language is just a tool of the powerful, the oppressors, so to speak. So, this comes from Nietzsche. For example, Nietzsche said that everything's subject to interpretation, language, right? Everything's open to interpretation. And whichever interpretation prevails at a given time, is a function of power and not truth. Those in power define what's true, right? That's a huge part of his thinking. So truth becomes relative. And he's okay with this. Nietzsche is saying that's just how the world works. The powerful get to define truth. And that's how it should be. So he would be, it seems to me that Nietzsche would be in favor of somebody like Trump if he's just using language, because that's what Nietzsche was encouraging people to do, to exert their power over others. So even though these ideas come from Nietzsche, what might be different is that Nietzsche would take the side of the oppressors. He would say, it's good for oppressors to oppress because that's what they're supposed to be doing. That's how nature works. There should be oppressing others because they're exerting their will to power and trying to accomplish their own desires. Whereas critical theory would, see things the way Nietzsche saw them, but would say that no, oppression is bad. And they would take the side of the oppressed in critical theory. But still a lot of Nietzschean ideas running through critical theory. So other things that become a big part of postmodernism is a critique of the Enlightenment, critique of reason, and critique of democracy. So a lot of his critiques of those things just get carried along in the postmodern way of thinking over the next 120 years after Nietzsche. Now just to wrap up his own personal life, he went insane in 1889. So most historians think it was because of syphilis that he got from visiting a prostitute. We don't know for sure. But he went insane for the last 11 years of his life, and then he died in an asylum in the year 1900. So that was what happened to him personally. But what we're most interested in is, of course, his ideas and how they've influenced the thinking of Western culture over the last 100 years. Well, let's transition and talk about the class logistics real quick. If you want to pull out your class schedule, we're wrapping things up. Got about a month left of the class. So today is November 5th, and there was no reading due today because we wanted to give you time to work on your research paper, which is due today, November 5th. Make sure you email that to Caleb by midnight tonight, November 5th. Next week, you do have a couple chapters to read back in the Schaeffer book, and so you'll have some reading summaries that are due next week on November 12th. We're going to talk about existentialism next week. November 19th is a normal week too, some reading summaries. Then we'll take a break for Thanksgiving, so November 26th, no class, of course. December 3rd seems to be a pretty normal week. You got some reading summaries due December 3rd. And then on December 3rd, Caleb will give you your final exam. So December 3rd, you'll get your final exam. It'll be similar situation in the midterm where it'll be open book, open note. You can take it home, work on it all week. It'll be essay, just like the midterm, and then you'll have to email it back to him completed on December 10th. There won't be any class on December 10th. December 3rd will be our last class, our last lecture, but your final exam will be due on December 10th. So you'll have to email that to him by midnight. And then also due December 10th is the historical survey paper. So it might be a good idea to take some time over Thanksgiving to start preparing, at least putting your notes together, but you'll have to obviously watch the last lecture on December 3rd before you can finish your historical survey paper. But you could at least start writing your historical survey paper on the history that we've covered so far. And look in your syllabus for the details concerning that historical survey paper. The length, the formatting, all that stuff will be in the syllabus. But you can start working on that now. Just won't be able to write the end of it, of course, until we finish all the history, which we won't do till December 3rd. As always, if you have questions about the class, email Caleb. If you have any questions or thoughts about the class content, go ahead and email me. I'd be glad to help.